I do want to just kick off our first keynote. So you might have come across his op-eds about the intersection of climate change and higher education. So please welcome the director of the Center for International Higher Education, Professor Hans de Wit. Oh,
it's really, yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I think CANIE is a really important network for the field of international education to bring us conscious about our own role to what we bring with, to the world on the positive side, but also on the negative side of the impact it has on climate. When I was asked to give this keynote, I was wondering why, because to be quite honest, over the past 40 years, with the exception of the past 2.5 months, I have been traveling around the world at least once, if not more than 3 times a month. And so I'm not really an excellent example of how we can stop climate pollution. On the other hand, I have been always a strong advocate of the second component of international education, which is internationalization at home. And I also, in the past, have been a strong supporter of the collaborative online international learning actions developed by the people in SUNY system in New York to make virtual exchange, virtual interaction possible as an alternative for physical mobility. So in that sense, I feel really very much connected with the issues and the agenda that the CANIE Network is proposing. To be real, the reality is when we talk about international education or internationalization of higher education, then the fact is that most people still feel that it is related to mobility. Mobility of students and faculty and programs and campuses, but most for all, mobility of students, either for a full degree, the international degree mobility, or as part of your home degree, the study abroad exchange programs that exist. In particular, the international student recruitment dimension has been growing over the past 30, 40 years substantively, has every decade doubled, and we are now over 5 million students that are studying in another country than their own. And the prognosis before COVID-19 were that this would be increasing to at least 8 million in the next decade to come. Also, study abroad as part of home degree by the support in Europe to the Erasmus program has been increasing, and in the United States as well. It has been less dominant in other parts and other countries of the world, but still together, these movements of students make also an enormous impact on the mobility numbers that we see around the world. And increasingly, those studies abroad experience for your home degree are shorter, and so the frequency even has a higher impact on climate than in the past, where most of the mobility was much more a semester of a full year. So we cannot ignore that our field of international education contributes substantially to the pollution of our planet. And so it is very important to see how can we change that. And it is a fact that the movement for internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum, was something that already 20 years ago started in Europe with the internationalization at home movement, saying, what about the 95% of the students that are not mobile? Should we not focus much more on those students when we talk about internationalization of higher education, and we talk about how they can get more international intercultural competencies, how they can become more global citizenship without necessarily have to move. A similar movement around that time was happening in Australia and the UK, to a certain extent also in Canada and the US, but mostly the UK and Australia, where there was a reaction to the very strong revenue-driven international student recruitment in those countries, saying, well, but what about the content of the curriculum that those international students get, that our local students get? Is that really international? Is that really intercultural? Should we not much more focus on internationalization of the curriculum? And as a result of that, there was a strong movement even 10 years ago, when we saw that there was not so much change yet in the focus on mobility, about rethinking internationalization. An essay that Uwe Brandenburg and I wrote in 2011, The End of Internationalization, was basically saying, we are treating international education as a tradable commodity much more than as a content-wise focus on international intercultural values, about citizenship development, about internationalization for society, for the sustainable development goals. So we should end this focus on international mobility as a movement. Also, you see back in the comprehensive internationalization approach that was happening in the United States at that time, to say we have to internationalize the whole of the institution. We should not fragment it to mobility and study abroad. We saw also a movement by the International Association of Universities about rethinking internationalization. We really have to go back to those values. But the reality was that until this COVID-19 crisis started, that still the focus in international education was on mobility, on the movement of students, on the movement of faculty, and increasingly also on the movement of administrators and also of educational leaders. We go to massive conferences, NAFSA, EAE, the Australian International Education Conference, AMPE in Mexico, FOBAI in Brazil. There was always more conferences taking place, and it increased every time. If I wanted, I could speak or present on a conference every week of the year. So we were extremely in this mood and continue to be in this mood of the only way we can communicate with each other is by mobility and by stepping into planes. And that was the reason why Philip Albach and I a few months ago said to ourselves, where are we? We are talking about values and principles of international education. We're talking about sustainable development goals as an important driver for international education. But in reality, what we all do, and that includes me and him, we are still traveling. We are still moving around and contributing to the pollution of our planet. And should we not start to address the challenges related to that? And we came across the CANIE Network at that time, and so we made reference to it in our blog and University World News, and really recognizing the importance that from the field itself, from even the business, you can say, as one of the founders in her introduction said, that even there, they are becoming aware of the importance that we have to change our approach to international education. It's important to say that we should not abolish mobility at all. It's not possible, it's not desirable, because the interaction in person between individuals, between students, between teachers, between administrators, is an important way of understanding how we are interacting with each other in the world. And so it contributes to mutual understanding that we have this possibility to meet each other. But at the same time, it is important that we say it is not only necessary to do it that way. And so movements like internationalization at home, collaborative online international learning, global citizenship development, and internationalization curriculum, all those movements were important and increasingly became much more part of our agenda of international education, but as I said before, not really making still a substantial change. So what we have to do? And in that sense, I must say the COVID-19 crisis creates an opportunity. An opportunity to understand that it is possible also to communicate in a different way. As we mentioned in the introduction, this summit was already planned to be virtual. But what we see now that other organizations like NASA and the European Association for International Education, etc., have had to decide to cancel their conferences and provide virtual alternatives. And that we see everywhere. Now we are at Zoom, sometimes in my case, 5 or 6 times a day to meet with other people, to give webinars and to give this kind of summits and to teach classes, etc. And what you then see is how surprisingly interactive and international, intercultural these kind of events are. When in the past I had to go to a conference in, let's say, Brazil, I had to travel for a full day to get there with all the impact on pollution. I also had then to speak to maybe 300 people, mainly from the Latin American region. And then I had to travel back for a full day. And that was my experience. In itself, I would not say that that is bad. But what we see now that I have webinars, and including this summit, where I can reach 400 people. And 400 people from all over the world who connect via Zoom or other platforms and who are able to ask questions, to make comments, to provide feedback. So it is much more international and intercultural than all those workshops, seminars, conferences that are organized around the world. So let's learn from that experience. Let's see that we can also think when we organize something, we do it differently. My own Center for International Higher Education was planning to organize a conference in October and for our 25th anniversary. And now we decided to postpone it for a year, but also do something virtual and see how we then can do it differently. And so what I see is also the fascinating experimenting by doing it. Like you do it in the Americas event and in a Pacific event, because you have to deal with the time zones. That you do it not over a full day with lots of presentations, because people, certainly on the internet, but the reality is also in many conferences don't have the time span to listen more than 20 minutes to a speaker. So if you have then a webinar or a summit with 10 presenters, it doesn't really work. So you have to do it differently. So it's fascinating to see how much we learn from this experience to experiment in different way of communications. And let's only hope that we're not going back to normal after the crisis is over. First of all, we don't know how long it will take. And if the reality is, it might be that this crisis never gets over, but there will always be surges again or new pandemics coming to us. So we have to say it is not a wise idea to go back to the situation of pre-COVID-19. We cannot reset the button and think that we are going to recruit international students in the same way as we have been doing before, by organizing all fairs around the world, by having massive movements of students, etc. We have to be much more creative. We have to be much more virtual, but we also have to say, maybe not always is necessary to go abroad. Maybe we can do it differently. We can do it virtually by dual degree programs, etc. We have to be much more innovative, creative, to give an alternative. And again, as I said before, I'm not against mobility. I think mobility is a very important part of our life, and in particular the intercultural communication that we learn from that. My own experience as a student when I was for a year in Peru, has been really life-changing for me, as has been the experience of all who have been traveling and studying abroad. So I will not say we should stop that, but we can look at ways how we can reduce the numbers, how we can use the number of activities, how we can create alternatives for those who are not yet mobile, and to do much more virtually, as we should do, to make not only the planet better, but also to make international education much more inclusive. Because the reality also is that the mobility is only for a very few group. The mobility of degree-seeking students is mainly from the higher middle class in the developing world to the global north. The mobility for home degrees is from elite students in the United States who have the resources to do that. It has always been a reality that international education has been very elitist. And so not only from the point of view of climate, also from the point of view to make it much more inclusive, it is important that we go much more focusing on the digital opportunities that this COVID crisis has manifested, but we were there already before we didn't use them. So that, in my view, is very important to do. And we, as leaders in international education, and we, as including myself, have to give the right example. Higher education rectors and other leaders have also to learn that many of the meetings that they organize can be done virtually, that we know now how to do it, that we know how to mute and unmute ourselves, that we know how to share screens, that we have to be capable to be much more interactive than if we would be meeting physically. So it is a unique opportunity as a result of COVID-19 that we can move forward, making international education much more climate neutral. We should take that chance. We should not go back to the old times, but take advantage of the lessons learned over the past months. And we need the full support and the actions and the motivations that the founders of the CANIE Network have given us to really make international education much more at the service of society and of our planet. And with that, I close my keynote and look forward to further discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor DeWitt. That was really wonderful. And, you know, it echoed a lot about what we heard in the Australia Summit yesterday. Rebecca Hall had posted in our chat a quote that said, "Nothing should go back to normal. Normal wasn't working. If we go back the way we were, we have lost the lesson. May we rise up and do better." And that sounds very much like the message we received today. So thank you so much for joining us. That was really wonderful.